Welcome, and thank you for joining panOpen's Teaching in a Crisis webinar series. I am Sonia Visser, Regional Sales Manager for panOpen. panOpen is an OER-based courseware platform designed by educators that radically reduces textbook costs while freeing faculty from the constraints of commercial copyright. panOpen offers complete reviewed content, customization tools, assessments, analytics, LMS integration, and a means of financially sustaining campus-based OER efforts. Due to the severe strain on institutional and student budgets, there has been a recent turn towards remote digital learning, and panOpen is here to bridge the gap. If you're interested in a more detailed demo of panOpen and to learn how to customize your content for your fall courses, our contact information will be listed at the end of the webinar. As you're preparing to teach government, sociology, psychology, or other introductory courses in the fall, what are the best tools, techniques, and educational resources for remote learning? In the midst of the global pandemic, the resulting economic recession, as well as ongoing racial injustices, how will you adapt your fall courses to address these concerns? The goal of our discipline-specific summer webinar series is to address these questions. Before we get started, let me just go over a few ground rules. We have disabled the chat, but we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A section that's found at the bottom of the screen. We will be monitoring the questions that you submit and will break periodically to allow for these questions. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, but we will provide, again, contact information and send out a recording of the webinar within 2 to 3 days. A sociology experiment recently partnered with panOpen to provide courseware for introductory sociology courses. This partnership aims to improve sociology instruction by combining introductory works by outstanding sociology educators with the digital tools that faculty and students require for today's blended and online classrooms. I'd like to introduce you all to one of the co-founders and authors of a sociology experiment, Dr. Shamus Khan. Dr. Khan is a professor and the chair of the sociology department at Columbia University. He serves on the executive committee for both the Institute for Women, Gender, and Sexuality and for the Center for American Studies, and also serves as a core faculty member of the Columbia Population Research Center in the Mailman School of Public Health. He writes on culture, inequality, gender, and elites, and is the author of over 100 articles, books, and essays. He writes for The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Washington Post, and has served as a columnist for Time magazine. Dr. Khan, it's a pleasure to have you join us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
So I understand right now you are actually teaching an introductory sociology course called Understanding Society. What's it like to teach online right now during these times?
Yeah, I mean, so Columbia, I think like a lot of institutions was concerned about, what's going to happen in the months and maybe even years to come. And so they'd asked me to teach a summer course to kind of get a lay of the land. And so I decided to teach this new introductory course. And it's, been an experience for me. There's a lot of people who teach online, in the college and university setting, but I never have before. And so to me, that was just a totally new and different experience. And so I would have to say there's, been a pretty steep learning curve about what that's like. And it's not just that I'm learning how to teach online, it's also that the topic that we're teaching right now, sort of understanding society, is sort of, there are always things that are going on when you're teaching, but the experience of COVID, and then particularly here in the United States, this enormous period of protest and sort of a re-questioning of the kind of fabric of public life in American society, it's really been, both incredibly challenging, but also incredibly exciting to teach in this moment, because often it's really hard to convey to some students, international students, for example, or students who, grow up in particular kinds of contexts, what a series of arguments about race or a series of arguments about inequality. And right now, all of that is just like at the surface of everyone's experience. And so, I have to say it's been one of the most challenging, but also one of the most exciting teaching experiences that I've had. And I'm really glad that I'm doing it right now and teaching this kind of online intensive course.
That's great. So, how have you found, the tools and resources? Like, how have you found that teaching online? Like, what are some of the things that you're using and doing? And
yeah, I know. So when I'm drawing upon the teaching resources that Pat Sharkey, Gwen Sharp, and I developed as part of a sociology experiment, and so this was a vision that actually really Pat had 5 years ago, where he was sort of saying, like, it's a strange way in which we do textbooks, and people have to buy physical textbooks, but you buy a 20 chapter textbook and you might only teach some portion of it. It's fairly static and the quality is sometimes questionable, and that there's a weird thing where textbooks are sold to students, but actually textbooks are the main audience for them is the faculty, because you need things like slides to teach from, exercises, etc. And so about 5 years ago, Pat and I formed this company. It's a company to create a really sort of high quality textbook that has a student centered experience, but also the sort of faculty members in mind. And so we partnered with about 20 other authors to write these different chapters. And so I'm teaching from it for the first time. I used to teach the sort of intro course here at Columbia, but I haven't taught it for years. And so it's the first time I'm back teaching an intro course. And so, that teaching from that material has been super helpful. And, it's the material now that's also part of the partnership with panOpen. And, part of the reason it's been so helpful is that it's super flexible. So, my capacity to actually change the learning materials that we're teaching from, in a moment is unparalleled in comparison to, say, teaching from a fairly static textbook. And I can draw upon all of these resources to begin to talk almost immediately about things that are going on, and to make it part of the student learning experience. The things that have been really challenging for me is that, I have students who are in different places. And I mean that, in two senses. The first is, I have students who are in China, and so I'm teaching at 9 a.m. and it's 9 p.m. for them. And that's particularly challenging. But then there are also students who are in very different social conditions. So some of them are, in their parents' guest room in a, pretty nice. It's an Ivy League institution with a bunch of students, some of whom are incredibly wealthy. But Columbia is also, a fairly diverse institution. So I have some students who are like trying to take care of their kids while they're sitting through a classroom. And it really kind of brings to the fore, often when you're teaching, the sets of social backgrounds and experiences, home experiences that students have. They typically like bubble up as problems or concerns in the classroom where people can't get their work done, and you have to sort of talk to them about what's going on in their broader life, or they have challenges studying, but you actually you kind of physically see it to a degree that I normally don't. I also have found that it's just incredibly hard to get discussion going, and trying to figure out some practical things that I can do to facilitate that has been one of the major things I think I've learned, and that might be helpful for some of the people who are listening along. These are probably tools that many of them already have, but it's gotten me to think about sort of temporality in teaching. So classroom time and then time outside of the classroom, and how I can promote interactions between students. So there's a range of things that I'm doing right now. The first is to give very, very short lectures, and then immediately that are divided into very small segments, sort of 15 to 20 minutes, and then to break out into rooms. So I'm teaching on Zoom right now. Using the breakout room function is really helpful. And I often am not part of those discussions. So I sort of break the students out into rooms. I allow them, they have conversations without me and they sort of report back. And so there's this sort of experience in class where, I'm speaking for 15 to 20 minutes, breakout room for 5 minutes, report back, 15 minutes of lecture, breakout room, report back. And, it doesn't put me at the center of the interactions, and I don't hear everything that's happening. But as it turns out, I think that that's far better of an experience. The second is really learning from how it is that we can best do asynchronous learning. So there's the time in the classroom where I'm talking and then, they can ask questions. But then I'm doing a lot more interaction with them through the platform. So basically, they write in questions about things they don't understand in the reading. I sometimes do very short video answers instead of writing in the answers. So there might be a common theme of confusion. A recent one for students was like how Du Bois really conceptualized the relationship between slavery and capitalism. And so rather than write out a long response, I do kind of quick video response. And those asynchronous moments where they have a series of questions and I end up responding to them end up being super useful. And I'm actually using the classroom time, the 5 minutes that they're in the breakout room, to go to see the set of questions that they added to the material from the reading that they did. And so for me, it's not like a 5 minutes off. It's this period of time where they're having a discussion and then I'll be interacting with them through this other format. And so, those sorts of things help moderate some of the challenges. I still find that the students, I don't know if it's particularly me or what it is, that they're not reaching out as much as they would otherwise. And, virtual office hours, drop-in times have not really been working. And so I'm still working on some solutions to things like that, but maximizing the kind of synchronous, asynchronous experience, realizing that a lot of the interaction that they need is not with you, but with one another. And so finding time during lecture to kind of facilitate that. And then I teach via Canvas, like using discussion moments. And so, and then on panOpen, also using a range of discussion tools so that they can talk to one another. And a non-trivial portion of their grade for my class right now is requiring them to interact with one another. And so building into the assessment that I'm using interaction where they're required to sort of comment on each other's comments. And for me, it's not evaluating the quality of their comments, but just making sure that they do that. That has produced a lot more of the kind of connection that's otherwise been missing.
That's great. That's really good. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A from attendees, and just to remind everyone, please put those questions in there. So going back to when you were talking about those videos, are your short video responses available on YouTube or only in your online platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now they're only on the online platform, but one of the things that I'm doing over the course of this summer, tied with panOpen and part of a social experiment, it'll be actually available for anyone, is to give mini lectures tied to the material that we're teaching. And so for every single chapter, I'm sort of seeing where some of the confusion points are for students within the chapters. And it's not, sometimes, again, one of the advantages of having material like this is that there are confusion points for students in the textbooks. We can just literally rewrite it in the moment to provide clarity where that confusion is happening. And that ends up being super useful. But then the other thing that I'm doing is starting next week, I'm going to record basically about 40 to 50 short 4-minute videos. So sort of 4 per chapter, 3 to 4 per chapter that'll be publicly and freely available. The stuff that I'm doing as part of that, and encouraging the people who are writing the chapters to do some of the same stuff. And the hope will be eventually there'll be this kind of accompanying video diary and intervention that is in addition to the text. And some of it's just clarifying, but some of it is like a little bit of a deeper dive. So for students who may want to know a little bit more about some of the topics that's not just in the text, they can click on it and sort of see a video of a deeper dive into the logic of randomization and experimental method, or what Garfinkel really means by passing, or what the different models of state formation are, and what the Bell assist war making model is, talking a little bit more in a more detailed way about sort of Tilley's understanding of that. So that's in the weeds of sociology, but for students, especially those who kind of want to geek out on one of these things, or it gives them a different platform of learning. So part of it is reading, part of it is a lecture, some of it is this kind of 3 or 4 minute video.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. So changing topics just a little bit, as with everything that's happening right now, as I mentioned at the beginning, and really what we're trying to do within this webinar series of looking at all of these things, how have you integrated what's going on in the world, into your teaching and into your curriculum?
So, the summer course I'm teaching right now is super intensive in terms of it's 4 days a week. And so, but one of the things I'm doing, and actually I would do in the future, is playing into that intensive character, but then leaving a lot more space for students to bring up topics that they want me to talk about and us to talk about, to kind of guide them as the class goes along. And so some of that is that, I was saying that there's this discussion moments where I do kind of a 15 to 20 minute lecture and then a 5-minute break, and a 15 to 20 minute lecture and then a 5-minute break. But the other thing I do is that, it's basically for half a class every week, I have no lecture planned and I have nothing planned. Like, there are no slides, there's nothing at all. And so about a quarter of the class time, I leave open to them. And then the things that I do is I ask them to contact me in advance of that day so they know when it's happening. I also look at the ways in which they're interacting with the text to see the sets of questions that are being raised. And then they kind of know that that's the day it's more on them to raise the sets of things that they want me to talk about. And in some instances, I have to say, like, I'm sorry, guys, I'm not actually reasonably expert enough on this to give you anything other than my unmediated opinion, which is probably not responsible pedagogy. But in other instances, I'm able to kind of prepare for these sort of moments of teaching where it's 30 minutes where there's no lecture plan, and they can really guide the learning experience in ways that I wouldn't otherwise. And so, being comfortable saying things like I don't know to them is helpful, but also giving them a sense of the sort of, it's not just me that's learning how to teach online, it's them learning how to learn online. And so having that kind of student-centered understanding and creating sort of predictability. So sort of being like, this is how the class is going to go. We're going to have this pattern of teaching and breaking out, but then we're also going to have these other patterns of, at the end of every week. So it's, for me, I teach Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. On Thursdays, it's the open section. So this open section where they can raise any set of things that they're really interested in learning about. And often I end up saying to them, I'm sorry, I don't really know, but on Monday morning, I can be prepped and ready to have a kind of 5-minute answer to that. Now, some of this is like a context often where I don't know a ton about what's going on. So, and what's going on is emergent. But what I've also been relying on hugely is our fellow sociologists. So, people who've written chapters for us as part of a social experiment that's now on panOpen is our Rashawn Ray. So Rashawn has been doing a huge amount of work on race in this moment to try and kind of do public sociological work. And Rashawn edits contexts from the ASA, but he's been in the Washington Post. There's a series of videos with him through Brookings, and Rashawn wrote the race chapter for the social experiment. And so it's great because we are teaching from Rashawn's material, and then I can kind of point to some of the stuff that's going on right now and sort of lift up his scholarship. Pat Sharkey, who's one of my co-editors on this, has been writing a series of public policy op-eds on urban policy, and he wrote the urban chapter for the textbook, as well as sort of what it means to defund the police and why this might be a great idea and what some of the problems for it might be. And so drawing upon contemporary materials and being able to integrate them into the text itself is really kind of a wonderful thing to be able to do. And we will be launching an environment chapter in the fall as well. So it's not done yet, but it'll be done in a couple weeks, actually. And Dana Fisher, who's been doing all this incredible research on protest, who does also writes on the environment, wrote one of the chapters. And so drawing upon a range of stuff where since what panOpen kind of allows you to do and what our textbook allows you to do is integrate things in real time and to draw upon the people who actually wrote the chapters for that integration leads to something kind of like much more dynamic and exciting. It's a little harder as a teacher to manage because like you kind of have to be on your toes a little bit more than you would be with a sort of static material. But one of the big benefits in terms of what I've been working from is that like, in addition to writing the chapters, all of those people have also written, they've produced teaching slides, PowerPoint slides that are all in a common format. So like a huge amount of my prep is already done, like before I ever walk into the class. And so in addition to things like discussion questions and things like that, it makes it so that some of the stuff that I used to have to spend a lot of time on, like prepping lectures, I don't spend as much time on. And then having a much more dynamic kind of experience where I'm pulling in new materials is a little bit easier for me because I have that extra time.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. As you know, we've invited not just sociology faculty to the webinars, but across the board, different discipline areas. And we actually have a comment and a question from a professor who actually teaches physics. And he says that he has taught similar to you. He'd provide a question and put the students into breakout groups to solve problems. If he drops into a group, often the screens were black and the mics were off, the learning was compromised. And so he's just wondering, how do you motivate students to work together if they're not at the table together?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I had the same thing, and actually, it's a little frustrating to teach right now on Zoom because a lot of my students have their screens off. And initially I was like, they've got to have their screens on, but it's not fair to some students given the context that they're living in. It's really hard for them sometimes to have their screens on. So there are a few like little practical things that I've done with the breakout rooms to address this. The first is that you can know what the breakout rooms are, and then you assign a particular person who has to report back. So they don't volunteer, and everyone has to report back at some point in time. The second thing that you do is, or that I've done, I don't think you do, you can do what you want, is that when people report back, they have to report back on the collective sentiment of the group, but also on specific things that at least two other people said. And so if there's this kind of obligation of reporting back and people feel like I've got to report something back, and then other people will feel some degree of obligation, like not to make this too difficult on their peers, in part because they have that job in the future. And so I'm not sure in the context of physics what this would look like, but if it's, you're just trying to solve a practical problem and you say like, well, Sonia had this idea for solving the practical problem, and this was the issue that she raised in pursuing that path to solving it, whereas Mark had a different kind of an approach, it then begins to get people enlisted. I also talk to them about, making sure that they at times at least try, if they can, to show their faces with one another. I have to say I haven't been as successful with that, but thinking about the breakout rooms as times where there has to be reporting back of a collective project, and it's not just the solution that they have to report back. It's the process that they have to narrate where they name at least two other people. It creates a little bit more of a sentiment of like, this was our journey of discovery. Or another way of putting it is like, I want them to report back on the process more than the product. Because if it's just the answer, then the report back can be very brief. But if it's the process of coming to that answer, it facilitates a little bit more interaction and a little bit more of saying, like, these different people said these different things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's excellent. One other question from the audience. So you mentioned, you're bringing these topics in, and the students are discussing, their concerns and asking you questions. When you're discussing COVID or the Black Lives Matter movement in this online context, how are you managing student emotions or trauma and the conversations around these issues that are so present in the students' lives right now?
Yeah, I think it's always hard to know what's going on with students, and it's particularly hard in this online learning experience. And so, when students are not speaking in class, sometimes it can be because they're very upset about what's happening, and sometimes it's because they worked the night shift and are super tired and can't actually speak in class. And I try not to I overinterpret the sets of things that are happening with my students, because I really just don't know what's happening. And instead create a space where people feel somewhat comfortable sharing things. And there's a wide range of ways in which I try to make that happen. One is to come into the class like as a whole human being, not just a professor. And so being kind of a little bit transparent with them about how I'm feeling and making that an acceptable thing to discuss is a little bit helpful. So I talk about like my own confusion, my own lack of clarity about some of the things that are happening, my own frustrations, some of the challenges that I'm facing. And it's not deeply personal. It's not challenges in my personal life. But I live in New York City, and I live, I think across the country, there's been this issue of like fireworks, but it's been particularly acute in Harlem, where I live, where there's fireworks going off all night. Yes. So, I raise up like, I haven't been sleeping. It's like kind of getting to me. But then I use that to talk about like, why is that happening? And there are different economic explanations. There are some explanations that people are saying, oh, it's a form of protest. And trying to make it acceptable to have that kind of conversation. The second thing that I've done is, and this would be unique not to sociology, but to the social scientists, so I don't think it'll be as easy for the physicists in the room to do. But one of the things that I've done is I've adjusted the evaluations to ask students to, almost all my texts right now are explain a concept and use it to make sense of something that's happened in the last week. And so, asking them basically to take the conceptual apparatus that we're providing them with through these materials and apply it to some of the protests that are happening, or to public health crises, or to the political situation, so that asking students to kind of be present in that is helpful. But in terms of the question about like, what do I do if students are experiencing traumas relative to things like the Black Lives Matter movement and what it means for their own particular identities and experiences. I don't do a lot. I don't have a lot to do with that, other than I've integrated a lot of things in my syllabus about resources that are available within the community and campus, and I make students aware of that and actually remind them of it, I'd say about once a week, and sort of to point them in that direction, in part because I am concerned about the dynamic of the classroom and the student experience, but it's also like I don't have expertise in managing the kinds of experiences that students are having. And I could, in fact, do harm by assuming a range of things that I'm not capable of or fully competent to address. And so, part of what I view as my task is not, quote unquote, helping students. It's helping students get the help that they need. And so that is sort of something that I build into the syllabus and other parts of my teaching.
Very good. Very good. So, as a world-renowned sociologist, what can sociologists bring to the understanding of this moment?
So, I think there's sort of three things that I would point to here. One is not uniquely sociological. It's tied to public health and the recent work I've been doing in public health more broadly. But the first is ecological models and thinking about things ecologically. And what that means, in the simplest version of it, it's thinking about the ways in which things work on the individual, the relational, the organizational, and the cultural and structural level. And so, when analyzing what's happening, we have to think about why individuals do what they do. But then we have to think about how it is that doing on individuals is influenced by the sort of pattern or structure of the relationships that they're in, and how it is that the organizations that they're a part of have a big impact upon that, and how large-scale structural conditions. And so that may seem vague, but it's like, why is it that people are, not wearing masks? Well, we can explain that relative to a series of individual personality traits, which isn't a terrible explanation. It's not going to be a great one, but it's not totally wrong. And then, so we could look at that, and then we could expand and say, well, it's not just the ways in which individual personalities, we need to layer onto that the structure or pattern of their social network. So what are other people in their community also doing, and how does that impact them? And then we do an organizational analysis as well and say, like, well, what are the institutions and organizations in their life, and how is it that they relate to those, and how are those influencing their health behaviors? And then finally, we could think about a cultural and structural way. So the first thing I think sociology provides is a sort of multi-level model of insights where you think about individuals, relationships, organizations, and culture or structure as all guiding behavior. And if you do that kind of analysis again and again and again, it can be super helpful. So rather than screaming at people like, you need to wear a mask, you take a point of view of like, well, why is it that people are doing what they're doing, and what are the different levels of influence that are producing those behaviors? I think in this particular moment, a historical perspective is incredibly important. And so, understanding why it is that people do the sets of things that they do relative to protest is, knowing why previous protests worked and what got people to protest, what moved them forward. That historical perspective is enormously helpful in this moment. And that points to the third. So I think the sociologists can help contextualize a range of protest movements, from the civil rights movement to women's movements to the LGBTQ movement, and then to think about the intersectionality of these movements right now and how it is that they're combining. And that points to, I think, the final thing, which is it's not just the historical perspective, but, and this is really me really speaking to my fellow sociologists, but like, I think of sociology as a discipline that sits at the intersection of the social sciences. And what I mean by that is we have like sort of stratification, which is deeply tied to inequality. We have the sociology of culture, which is deeply tied to anthropology. We have social psychology, which is deeply tied to psychology. We have the historical method, which is deeply tied to history. We have political social, which is tied to political science. And so one of the things that sociology does really well is not, from my perspective, of having an absolutely unique perspective of the social sciences, but instead it's sitting at the intersections of all of them and drawing upon a range of tools. I remember in graduate school, one of my best friends, a woman named Jessica Brown, said, like, I love sociology because I can do whatever I want and call it sociology. I think that's kind of true, and it's kind of false. I mean, I share her love of sociology, and it's partially that, like, we get to draw upon all of these incredible insights from neighboring disciplines to generate an understanding of why the social world works the way that it does.
Great. We do have a couple of questions from the attendees, and more on specifics of what you're using in your course. One is experiments that you're using, or for specific exercises that you might be using. Yeah.
The textbook, A Social Experiment, is just the name. So actually it's not just about experiments, but I draw upon a range of methodological approaches within the class. So there's an entire module on methodology, and then thinking about what are the advantages of causality and causal assignment? And here, I draw upon a few different kinds of experiments that I think are super helpful for elucidating this. The most obvious that's probably widely used within sociology is the work of Diva Pager, who talks about both the effect of race on employment and the effect of a criminal record within that classic paper, The Mark of a Criminal Record. One of her students and co-authors, David Padula, has written some incredible stuff on intersectionality. And so I use experiments there to look at the ways in which he's got this great paper that shows basically that, there's a racial wage gap, but when it intersects with sexuality, some of the racial wage gap decreases. So he shows basically that in an experiment, people offer higher wages to whites than they do to blacks, but that if there's signals that the black applicants are gay, the wages are higher. And he's got this kind of proposition that the intersections of sexuality and race create a kind of context where the threats of black masculinity are moderated. And so that experimental work is super interesting to me. I teach Shelley Carell's work on gender and the ways in which people, she's got this great classic paper called Constraints into Preferences. And it's about the ways in which people's assessment of mathematic ability influences them and influences their own understanding of their competencies. It builds on a long psychological tradition of a little bit on Claude Steele about expectation states and how it influences performance, but it's this really sort of wonderful experiment that then ties to survey research. And one of the things that I really like about Pager and in particular Carell and Ridgway, Cecilia Ridgway's work, is how it is that they do this sort of causal assessment through experimental results and then tie it to less causal, much more associational survey data findings, so that you can both see the workings of sort of causal pathways and mechanisms through the experimental condition, but then take a big step back and be like, okay, what's happening on the population level? And with this population level, we may not be able to make causal claims, but we can then, say, well, we established causality in this one particular case, and it suggests that there may be something happening at the population level beyond this. It's a little in the weeds for the sociologists, but I love doing stuff like that and then constantly, layering on things like qualitative work onto experimental design, or when doing a kind of drawing upon qualitative work and talking through it, taking a moment to be like, this thing that the qualitative person said probably was happening. Here's an experiment that helps evaluate that. And there it's, you don't set up a boxing match between methods where one is right and one is wrong. Instead, the aim is to be like, methods create a foundation of knowledge so that they each are different building blocks that provide support for different kinds of things that in the end is kind of the foundation upon which, the house of knowledge is built.
Great. So given your perspective as a sociologist and teaching in the moment, what do you think was going to be different as we move forward?
So, I think right now, the one of the biggest take homes for me is just the necessity of having flexible, responsive content to the current moment. I mean, that there are, there are things that we teach where their textbooks are updated, in the 13th edition, and they're basically repaginating the thing to sell new versions to students, and that is, to me, morally indefensible and also not particularly useful in terms of its overall responsiveness. And so, one of the visions that Pat and I had with a social experiment was providing content to students that is very, very, very reasonable. So, a social experiment is $1 a chapter. It is really cheap. Students can use a social experiment, and the entire textbook costs typically around $10 for the entire semester. And what panOpen adds to that is we don't really have any, a social experiment is basically a series of PDFs that your students read. panOpen creates something that's way more dynamic, which allows both faculty and students to interact with the text and amend it and transform it over time. And so there's something incredible about having platforms where the content is sort of flexible and responsive. And I've tried to do this before, 5-10 years ago when I was teaching an intro course, where I was like, I'm just going to create new content where I'll draw upon new papers that are being taught all the time. And that, as it turns out, the barrier to getting that done was so high. But one of the advantages I think right now is like, there's a kind of base of work that we can draw upon along with all the teaching stuff that you need. So, the lecture notes, the course exercises, a test bank, etc. But where it's not fixed, it's like it's something that you can actually interact with and transform. And, to me, it's super helpful in this moment. But I think that if we could like actually change our pedagogical practices, like, I'm not big on like COVID is an opportunity. Like, it's actually not. I mean, maybe it's an opportunity, but it's actually this moment of enormous suffering and I think collective trauma that the country's going through. But if we could adjust our teaching practices a little bit to integrate this kind of dynamism into the ways in which we're teaching, I think that would be super helpful. I'm 41 years old and I've been teaching for a while. I've been at Columbia for 13, 14 years now. And I think it's pretty humbling to see how insufficiently expert I am on a lot of things that are of young people's, are particularly of interest to young people. So the social of the environment, for example, I am totally insufficiently expert on. It's embarrassing. I should be better. But one of the things that I'm learning is just how much it's possible to rely upon the expertise of others in order to get me over that hump. And then I think like, I'm much more attuned right now to the whole life of students. It's a little bit easier particularly in residential colleges, just to think of the classroom as like the classroom. And right now, to me, I'm super aware of the student experience that goes beyond the lecture. And right now, I'm sort of thinking about how I'm going to redesign all of my classes where, if I think about my own pedagogy, like I would say 85% of the time is course planning and lecture prep with an orientation to the synchronous moments of learning where I am physically present with students. And I think that 85, probably 90% of the time should be 50. And that the other 50% of the time that I teach should be, and this isn't saying I need to spend more time teaching. It's that like I need to adjust to realize that like much of the student experience is actually in these moments where I'm not present. And I need to think more about how it is that students are interacting with material in moments where I'm not present. And one of the advantage of a bunch of this kind of course management software stuff is that it allows me to see the students interact with the materials in ways that I wouldn't always be able to see before. So I literally get to see like how it is that they're encountering and interacting with the text. And so I'm trying to work on balancing, from spending, 80 to 90% of my time prepping for that synchronous moment to like maybe 2/3 of my time for that synchronous moment. And then 1/3 of my time, or maybe even half, figuring out how they're interacting with the material and actually learning. And so I think that's super helpful. So I think that's kind of what my big take-homes have been so far in teaching in this moment.
One of the questions came in regarding, the students and how are you evaluating them in this online, world we're in?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, and actually, I gave my first, so I'm in this summer intensive 6-week program, and I gave the first exam, and I quickly realized that like it was not, it was kind of multiple choice, short answer essays, and it didn't work. I mean, even students who I felt were getting it weren't quite getting it, and so I've changed the evaluation system kind of on the fly. And again, this is super helpful when you get to see and have the students interact with the texts in particular ways, where I was able to integrate evaluations on a daily basis, which aren't just like you have to solve a problem set. But I wanted to actually see them working their way through the course material, because so much of my evaluation is about, like, to return to an earlier theme, like product, not process. And I think that that's not helpful as a set of learning experiences for students, where we know this, that the best predictor for student performance in a course is what they know coming into the class. So, like, literally, if you give young people an exam on day one, that exam will be hugely predictive of their performance on the final day of classes. And what that suggests is that, like, it shouldn't be that surprising to us, but that one of the things that I think I can do more of is focus on the learning process itself. And right now I'm kind of in a place where previously, where I'd basically been, I'm going to give a lecture and then they have to take exams or fill out, like, short answer questions. It's all product based. It's all like, show me exactly what you learned. And now I can spend a lot more time with students, thinking with students about, like, what is the process of learning? How do you apply a concept? Like, where are you confused? And so it's developmental rather than evaluative. And so what does that mean in practice? Like, what do developmental tools look like along the way? So instead of asking people as they're interacting with material, like, what is the right answer to this question? It's like, how is it that you would think through this problem? Or what are things that are unclear about the ways in which this person thought through this problem? And so as an example, just recently I was teaching different models of state formation. So, 3 different ways in which people understood the emergence of modern European states. And, one is a Marxian model, which very obvious.
We lost you for a second there, Shamus.
Yeah, sorry. So what I was trying to convey to my students is, like, again, to rephrase I said before, it's not a boxing match. It's not like one is right and one is wrong. It's like, how are they useful? And can I see you guys thinking about it? And so those are the kinds of evaluations increasingly that I've been adding, which are they're process-based rather than product-based.
That's great. Switching gears for just a minute, we had another question from the attendees. And this is really speaking about university and colleges and during our crises, as they're looking at budget cuts, there are some programs that are perhaps being cut. One of them is sociology. And so this attendee would just love to know, so what are some of your ideas for defending sociology?
I mean, I think that this is kind of sociology's moment. Like, in this moment, we see the value of sociological approaches to the world. And so, I think you cannot explain what's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement as, like, economic and jobs, right? That is not what's happening. It's deeply economic, of course, about the experiences of racial discrimination and racialized violence has a little bit of a different story behind it. And I think that if we're thinking about COVID and the sets of health behaviors that people are engaging in and what's likely to be successful in communities, again, I think the sociological insights are absolutely essential here, particularly the ways in which sociology is deeply tied to all of these public health interventions. And, to be honest, like, my students right now are hungrier than ever for this kind of thing, for an understanding of the ways in which society is working or not working for some people. And for a long time, I always hated the word society because I was like, it's analytically vague. It doesn't actually mean anything. But increasingly, I think that one of the things that we as sociologists can do is argue more that actually issues require comprehensive, rather complicated, not simplistic understandings of we just need a bigger tax cut or tax increases in order to solve problems, but instead that these sets of things are deeply intersectional, they're grounded in history, and that we need to understand that sort of thing in its totality. And playing into that complexity and playing into the idea that sociology sits at the intersection of all of these insights, and we're going to need them all. We're going to need an understanding of culture. We're going to need an understanding of psychology. We're going to need an understanding of economics and stratification systems. We're going to need an understanding of politics. And we're not competing with these other disciplines. We're in some ways drawing upon them to create a complete picture, and arguing that is what sociology is. That is what we do, may help advance an understanding of sociology within state legislatures, et cetera, that's beneficial. And I also think, I'm a little bit of a positivist social scientist. So I think having evidence-based solutions to problems that emerge out of our discipline is a really good thing. And so arguing from that position and from our position as scholars and people who really know stuff is also very beneficial.
So we have time for about one more question, and this is really geared towards what you have learned from your students. Has there been an aha moment in this time of teaching and insights that you've learned from your students?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I've learned from my students, I think, in this last 6 weeks. And I have to say, I'm also, as much as I'm in the classroom teaching, I'm running a department. I'm actually, I have 2 more hours as department chair, and then I step down after my term is just up, and I'm very, very glad about that. But I'm also, I am the supervisor of 12 doctoral theses right now. So I have 12 graduate students who work directly with me. And, I think one of the things that I'm learning from all of those students about their experiences is that that the motivation is really their drive for understanding is profound, much more profound than what I previously assumed. I think I had and it could be that things have changed, or it could be that I was totally wrong before, but I kind of assumed that students have an instrumental orientation to their education, that they understood education as something that they needed in order to get something else. So education was a pathway to a desired outcome. And one of the things that I've seen, particularly in the last, 4 months, but even more so, I would say in the last year, is that I don't think it's good as sociologists that we think about education as explaining an outcome. So education explains earnings. And so students acquire education in order to be on a particular occupational trajectory. It's not wrong, but actually in the experience of learning, students actually like schooling as a thing in and of itself, that students enjoy the process of learning and seek understanding. And I think having a little bit less of a cynical orientation to why students are doing what they're doing, and taking as my default that what they want is understanding, has been a huge take home for me. And I've been able to see that much more dramatically in a kind of national context where understanding is a little hard to come by, where actually, and where we're all hungry to want to know in a way that maybe some of us were before, but not all of us.
That's great. Excellent. Dr. Khan, thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck this summer and in the rest of your class. And we want to thank everyone for attending today. I'm going to share my screen and put up our final slide, which is just our contact information. We hope you will join us for our future Teaching During a Crisis webinar series. We will send out reminders and invitations as those the dates are set in stone. So thank you all again, and thank you, Dr. Khan.
Yeah, thank you for having this event.